Hey everyone, welcome back to Shop Life. In this video we're going to be talking about the most common check engine light, which is for the P0171 and 0174 code. The code usually pops up whenever the car's computer realizes that the system is running too lean. When the engine is running lean, what that usually means is there's more air than there is fuel for the proper ratio in order for the car to be running properly. So that's why you get this check engine light, and I'm going to be showing you today the most common reasons for this check engine light to pop up. What I have behind me today is an E46. It is a 2006 BMW 330 Ci, but like I said, this is a very common issue among all cars. The only difference that you might notice is things might be named a little bit differently on your engine. They might be in different locations, but pretty much what I'm going to be telling you is going to be universal as far as most cars. Let's go and get started. So here we have this M54 B30, an amazing engine, but as most of you guys know, even though it's a 2006, it's still a 12-year-old car, and by now a lot of the rubber components have worn out. And that is one of the first causes of the check engine light, is a vacuum leak. So a vacuum leak is usually easy to tell. One of the main symptoms that you might have is when you're sitting at idle, the RPM might be jumping around a little bit, so it's called a bouncing idle. And if that's paired with the 0171, 0174, that usually indicates a vacuum leak. So let's go over most of all the common vacuum leaks first on this motor. So right off the top, the actual oil cap itself. So this cap has a seal on it. You can see the seal's pretty worn. This car in particular doesn't have a check engine light for it, but anyways, you can still see how this seal is worn. And since there is pressure in the crankcase while the engine is running, that can cause a vacuum leak. Along with that oil cap, we also have this valve cover right here. So the valve cover has a gasket, as you can see, which attaches to the head. And like I said, since the crankcase is under pressure or under vacuum, if the gasket is leaking really bad or the valve cover is cracked if it's made out of plastic, then that can also cause a vacuum leak. So continuing on this side, we have a secondary air pump right here. If you have an older model E46, your secondary air pump might look a little different. You might not have this section right here. You might only have one pump right here. This hose would also be different. But on those models, there's usually a vacuum line that runs from this valve all the way to the back of the manifold, which is the intake manifold. So on this one in particular, we don't usually have that issue because there isn't a vacuum line that runs there. But that's still another option for a vacuum leak. Now coming on to this side. This is the breather hose for the crankcase ventilation system. It's also known as a CCV system, which is composed of a bunch of different hoses. There's one right here, there's one underneath this cover. There's one that goes from the actual valve, which is located underneath the manifold, into the dipstick tube, and there's also another hose that comes from around the intake manifold right up to the top. So that's another common issue. A quick way to test if your CCV system is bad or not is to have the car running, put it in park, just leave it in idle. You can have your AC and everything turned off. So make sure the car is warmed up. It should be idling around 600 RPM or so. And while it's idling, all you have to do is just pull off this oil cap. And while it's running, you should be able to feel a slight vacuum when you put your hand over it. If it's really, really strong, that means that CCV valve has failed. Or it could just be another vacuum leak from one of those hoses as well. So that's a quick and easy way to check your CCV system. But moving on. Now, this is probably the most common issue, which is the intake boot. So this air intake boot, there's an upper and there's a lower, which attaches right here. Then you also have this F-style connector, and you have one of these hoses that goes to the fuel pressure regulator, which I also have a video on for this particular car. So as you can see, there's a vacuum line right here, and there's another hard vacuum line that connects it to the actual regulator, which is underneath the car. So this can also be a very common spot for a vacuum leak. Usually on these intake boots though, you'll see a leak form right in this crevice right here, formed in the boot in this crevice right in between this. Another common issue is if someone was doing some kind of service on your whole intake system and they did not tighten this hose clamp down or wasn't lined up properly with the matched airflow sensor, then you can also have an issue with that. The matched airflow sensor usually doesn't go bad that often, but that can also cause issues with that system running lean condition if it's not providing the right reading for the amount of fuel that needs to go in. So with mass airflow sensors, doesn't matter what kind of car you have, I usually recommend sticking to the OEM manufacturer. So try to get, it doesn't have to be genuine, but try to get an original manufacturer. So for the BMWs, it's usually Siemens VDO, or Siemens, however you want to say it. So try to stick with good parts, especially with any sensors on your engine. You don't want to cheap out on that, especially if it's in a spot where it's hard to reach. But moving on, we also have that lower intake boot, which is hard to see in here, but I have a manifold that's already pulled off, which I'll show you here shortly. But we also have this DISA valve. So the DISA valve is not common on most cars. The BMWs, most of them do have it, especially of this era. So the DISA valve has a flap inside. It's pretty much like an intake manifold actuator, which just regulates some of the air that's going through the manifold to help with the whole power delivery, making it smoother, improving torque and whatnot. So the valve itself, there's an O-ring that seals it when it goes in. Usually that's the most common area for leaking. But also another issue can be the valve itself. If it's lost all of its pressure, so it doesn't have any more resistance, that can also cause the 0171, 0174. And in that case, there are rebuild kits that you can get for the DISA valve. Just look into that. I have a video that details that, and I'll have that link down below. Now we also have this oil dipstick. So like the crankcase, everything is under vacuum for the most part. So the dipstick tube goes to the oil pan. There's an O-ring that's on the dipstick tube where it meets the oil pan. That can also cause a vacuum leak, or it could just be an oil leak for that matter. Then you also have the dipstick itself, which has little O-rings on it as well. You can even find these kind of O-rings at your local auto parts store. Just take one of these off, take it with you, and get the right size. Now, on older model E46 with the M54, you might also have a intake air temperature sensor. So on this one, the best way to tell if you have one or not is by looking at this connector for your mass airflow. If you have this style connector, then you don't have an intake air temperature sensor on the manifold. It's built into the mass airflow. If you have the older style, you're gonna have an intake air temperature sensor on the manifold, which I'll show you here shortly. Now, like I said earlier, the reason for the check engine light is usually when there's more air than there is fuel for the proper ratio. So if you have a weak fuel pump, that can also cause, the car to have a lean condition. So your car might run properly and everything, but if the fuel pump is not providing enough fuel, then you're gonna have the system running lean. The fuel pumps are usually a lot more expensive, and on some cars they're kind of harder to get to, so I would try to save that towards the end. And by now, if you're getting this check engine light, chances are the car's at least 5-10 years old, and most of those rubber components are worn, so you probably needed to replace them anyways. So it doesn't hurt to do all of the vacuum components all at once. It just makes it easier for you to just knock all of it out at once than having to keep chasing it down. So I have a manifold that's already pulled off. Let me show you some of the things I was talking about earlier. All right, so this is the intake manifold, which is attached right here. And this is a very similar one to that, but it is off of an older style M54, which does have that intake air temperature sensor that I was talking about. So there is a O-ring on that sensor that when you pull this tab, you should be able to lift it out and the O-ring comes out from in there. So that can cause a vacuum leak. This is where the DISA valve goes, and like I said, there's an O-ring on here that can cause vacuum leaks. Now we also have this brake booster hose. So this hose goes directly to your brake booster, which is located, that hose goes directly to the brake booster, which is located right here. So the brake booster hose, as you can see, this one's a little squished in, but for the most part, they don't usually leak that bad. Even the valve that they're connected to, they usually don't leak. But like I said, there's always that one car that has something that nobody else does. So if you're having troubles, that can be an issue. Another uncommon issue is the brake booster itself. So if you're sitting in your car at idle and with your foot off the brake, if you hear some kind of hissing noise inside the cabin, that usually means that the internal diaphragm on the brake booster has failed, which will require you to replace the entire brake booster, since the internal diaphragms are not serviceable. That is kind of a big job, since you do have to remove all of the master cylinder and all that. But that's, like I said, is a pretty uncommon issue, and you should be able to hear it right away. Now back at the manifold, so here's that brake booster hose that we were talking about. Here's the top vacuum line that goes to that upper air intake boot. Then we also have this line that goes to the fuel pressure regulator. And then you can also see the actual brake booster line that keeps going to the bottom of the manifold is right here. The lower intake boot attaches to the throttle body, as well as the idle control valve right here. The idle control valve also has a grommet that attaches to the intake manifold. which is this silver gray grommet right here. Those usually rarely fail, but if you're pulling off the idle control valve to clean it or anything, might as well replace that. Same thing with the throttle body. It has an O-ring on the back side of it where it attaches to the manifold. So if you're taking it off to clean it, which I highly recommend, might as well go ahead and replace that. Now here's the CCV that I was talking about earlier. So this is the actual oil separator valve, and there's quite a few hoses that attach to it. So the one that's missing right here goes from the bottom of the valve to the oil dipstick tube. So that's the one that's usually the most common as far as leaking, even if it's leaking oil or whatnot. So that's one thing that you want to check out. Then we have this one that goes to the valve cover, and this is also a very brittle plastic connection. So sometimes they do tend to break even when you're just doing like a valve cover gasket service. On the valve itself, there is a vacuum port which should be capped off, but if that cap is worn out, chances are the CCV valve itself is time to get replaced. But if you just want to replace that for now, you can try doing that. Now coming to the back of the manifold, so this is the part where you really can't see it unless you have the manifold taken off. Here's one of the vacuum switches. So there's vacuum lines that go all the way across. There's a one-way valve right here. You usually have these two sections capped off. And on some of the E46s, you'll have another vacuum container down here, which will have a vacuum line running from the manifold to the container, and then from the container into the cabin. So you want to check all of those out as well. Now one of the most uncommon ones are the intake manifold gaskets. They usually don't leak unless someone's messed with it, and if you're pulling off the manifold, if you're going through all that trouble, might as well replace it while you have it off. They're about 30 to 40 bucks. Go ahead and replace those, and that's pretty straightforward. As you can see, it just comes right off. So that pretty much covers most of all of the vacuum leaks, the common ones at least, and hopefully that helps you fix your check engine light. I'll have a bunch of videos linked down below that goes over most of those repairs, and also some of the products that you can buy, so that way you can go ahead and do the repair if you need to. But like I said, if you are chasing down any of these vacuum leaks, chances are most of those vacuum lines are done, so might as well just replace as many as you can. And that doesn't matter what kind of car you have, just try to replace them all. Vacuum lines are not that expensive. If they are molded, then yes, they might be a little bit more, but if you can find the part online, it's usually a little bit cheaper. But anyways, thanks for watching. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. Or if you guys want me to do another one of these videos with more common check engine light codes or whatnot, feel free to list any codes that you might want me to cover, and I'll try to do that on my next one. Thank you guys for watching.